Good evening once again, and welcome to Bleeple.com. I'm Hugh Nolan. This is not the Hugh Nolan Show. This is a special broadcast we are bringing to you with an interview with the young lady seated to my left. This is Battista-Frazee, who is the author of a memoir called The Pornographer's Daughter. Kristen is the daughter of one of the men who was a distributor of the adult film Deep Throat, and one of the men who was prosecuted for his activities regarding that distribution. Kristen, welcome to you.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
How has it felt to be doing these interviews on this particular subject, which I'd imagine at some point can occasionally become uncomfortable?
Well, I mean, sometimes they're fun, and it's great to talk about my family and the experience writing the book, and sometimes, you know, there are people who don't necessarily agree with pornography and what it's all about, and so sometimes I could get a little hairy, but overall everyone has been really great about it.
Now, those who feel that way, is that something that at least initially made you feel at all defensive? Is that something that's a bit uncomfortable for you?
Sometimes, and you know, I've always kind of taken the philosophy, I've never had a problem with pornography or what it was, and I've always seen it as a very individual experience for the person, and I've really tried to take the perspective from First Amendment's right perspective that everyone has the ability to choose that kind of material and view it and use it within their own personal lives how they want. And also, it's, you know, as we have a discussion here today, it's difficult to really pinpoint what is obscene for one person may not be for something else. And I feel like the struggle I think we've had as a society, and maybe today we'll even explore a little bit of some of the precedent and the law and some of the Supreme Court cases that have gone on in the last 4 years. It's always been that struggle of how do you really determine what's obscene for one person. For one person, and times change as well. Our culture has changed over time. What was considered obscene or shocking 40 years ago certainly really isn't by today's standards. So,
do you think it's a kind of a thought experiment, because you can't unknow what you know? But do you think if you did not have the personal connection through your father to the industry, that your attitude would be what it is today? Do you think that in some way perhaps humanized for you, or made you more aware of it as something that is in some ways not entirely dissimilar from other businesses and other
that's a fair statement, and I would definitely say if my family wasn't personally connected to the adult industry, maybe I would feel differently about it.
Talk to us about how one of my favorite passages in the book, one of my favorite things in the book, and I would imagine it was one of the more difficult things for you to write, was the way you learned about your father's involvement. Could you tell us about that?
You know, my grandmother Maria, she's such a big character in this book, and she was certainly outspoken, and I guess she really wanted to treat me as, when I became a teenager, she wanted to treat me as an adult, and shared with me a lot of the stories about my family, some of our history, and some of the more painful things that had happened. So, learning about it initially through her, and then as I got older, my parents just being very honest and sharing with me what the story was. And part of me was, you know, coming to grips with, gosh, this was such a stressful time in our lives. And then the other part of me was really, truly fascinated by what the story was. And I kind of grew this desire to learn more about it and document it, which is the product is this book.
Now, I would imagine that when you are writing a memoir, and who knows, maybe one of these days I'll have the nerve to do it, but I wouldn't dare now. But I would imagine when you're writing a memoir, that to some extent there's almost a reliving of events.
Yes, definitely.
And I'm wondering if the things that were most difficult to live are the same as the ones that were most difficult to write, or were you surprised to discover that it was actually more difficult to deal with certain things in retrospect than it was at the time?
Do you know, I'd have to say the whole experience of doing the writing and putting it down on paper and having the conversations kind of, I think for me, put things in the right perspective, and really, in my mind, you know, they kind of say when you bring things to life and when you bring them out in the open and when you let light shine on those things maybe that were in dark places in your mind, they're not so scary anymore, and they don't have as much power as they once did. So in a lot of ways, I feel like this memoir was, I don't want to be corny about it, but it was kind of freeing in a way. It was like you write your story, you say your truth, and it is what it is, and you know, you could just kind of stand by your story and be proud of it. Because really, in the end, my family, we turned out okay.
I'm going to pin you down a little bit more than that. I'm going to ask you what it was that was the most difficult thing to write.
Probably the struggles my mom had were tough. That was very tough, and I think some of the things that she went through.
Tell us about some of those things.
Her hospitalization. You know, I've been very open on my blog and things that I've done. I really feel like my whole career in mental health really started, those early seeds of some of my mom's struggles were started and catapulted me and had a desire to move into the social work profession. So I earned an MSW degree. For a very long time. I worked in the mental health advocacy community for a couple of really great organizations, Mental Health America and the National Council for Behavioral Health. And I believe it was very rooted in a lot of those early experiences.
Now, to what extent, and this may be impossible to answer, but I'd be interested in the process of thought when you're handling this question, which I'm sure you've been asked before. But to what extent do you attribute the stress and the pressure, not only of your father's involvement in these particular kinds of businesses and activities, but the fact that he faced legal action? To what extent do you think that the stress of having her husband under that kind of pressure and having, in fact, her entire family at various times under surveillance by federal agents and under essentially the prosecution was only of your father, but of course the pressure of the government preparing that prosecution was something that had to be felt by the entire family and certainly by your mother.
Absolutely.
And to what do you feel that that is primarily responsible for the difficulties that she had? Or?
I think that was some part of it. I can't totally blame my parents' whole experience on that, but I think it was a very big part. If the stressors of that trial would not have happened, I think most of the turmoil that my family experienced would not have happened.
Now, how old were you when your father actually went to trial?
Well, there were two trials. There was one in 1976 and one in 1978. So the first trial was when I was about 6 years old, and then the second trial was in 1978. My father started distributing, I believe, sometime in late 1973 and distributed for 11 months up until when he was arrested in July of 1974. And in those years, I was 3-4 years old, so I was very young, like not quite yet having any memory about what that meant. My memory during that time is really the recounting of stories that were retold to me. And I have, you know, piecemeal memories of what went on during that time from a child's perspective, of course.
Now, I would not want to give the impression to the viewer that that this is the sum and substance of your father, Anthony Battista's entire professional career. So talk to us a bit about how it is that he came to be involved in distributing Deep Throat, because this is an item on a lengthy resume.
Exactly. My dad was, you know, from working class Italian American family. He went to college. He was a graduate of Villanova. He earned an economics degree, and he was a stockbroker. He got the opportunity to distribute Deep Throat from a college friend who just offered the opportunity to do this distributing on the side as a side business in the Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania area, the Philadelphia area. And he did it, and it was very successful, and it was successful to the point of the federal government coming in and, you know, prosecuting the obscenity. And specifically for that trial, it was an assistant district attorney in Memphis, Tennessee, named Larry Parrish, who was prosecuting under the California versus Miller law in which states that a local community can decide what is obscene for their community. So he took it upon himself to say, this obscene material is coming into the Memphis area, and I'm going to prosecute everyone who is associated with this film. Producers, the actors, the director, everything.
So one of the flaws of this approach, of course, would be, I presume, that in theory, your father could have been prosecuted by 80 communities around the United States, had they all rested on the same legal theory.
I guess technically, yes. I guess if every single community across the country that was receiving these films executed those, decided to prosecute and indict, quite possibly, yes.
Now you've become quite educated, I know, from reading your blog, and you're blogging now where? Where can people find you?
I'm at my website at KristenBattista-Frazee.com, and I also blog at Huffington Post.
And in that capacity, I've read much of what you've written on Huffington Post.
Thanks.
And in that capacity, I'd imagine you have a pretty good grasp of where things stand legally today. Do you think that that kind of single community prosecution could even happen today in the explosion of pornographic material on the internet and of the expansion of adult businesses into the mainstream?
You know, the laws exist as they are, that communities can still prosecute what they deem as obscene for their community, but the internet has really changed everything, and the notion of what is community is no longer the same as it was 40 years ago when those early obscenity trials took place. So the internet has definitely changed everything. I believe the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which is part of the Telecommunications Act, it actually relieves the FCC of having any control over deeming any content that's happening on the internet as obscene. I believe that's the intent of that act.
That's my
if any bleeples out there know differently, I'd love to hear more about that.
And it'll be interesting too, when we'll get into this, it actually had not occurred to me until now, but of course, given our enterprise here, we take a great interest in the recent activities regarding net neutrality, the recent decisions regarding net neutrality, so it'll be interesting to see how that, I'm throwing you a real curveball
there. Yeah, you
there.
are.
But I'm really throwing that more as a general question to those who are watching us than I am a specific question for you. Now, of course, when you're talking about even mainstream films, when you're talking about even Hollywood-produced films, there's a real remove between those who do the production and those who do the distribution. In other words, you know, it's not like your father was standing on the set when Deep Throat was being filmed.
No,
now,
that's right. That's
to what extent did your father have interaction, and to what extent have you, in writing the book and in doing your work on your own, have had some interaction with people who actually are directly involved in the production?
You know, I've had a great experience working with some folks who work in the adult industry, and I'm thinking specifically of folks over at Wicked Pictures, who in 2012 I had the chance to interview for a Deep Throat 40th anniversary article, Jessica Drake and Stormy Daniels, and other great stars too, like Joanna Angel, Alexis Ford, Kiani Lay, and one other actress who's really wonderful. It'll come to me. But I had a great opportunity to talk to these women about their perspective on Deep Throat and what it's meant to the industry. And you know, these women are intelligent. They're business women. They have big brands, and I have to say, now versus what it was 40 years ago, it's a much more corporate and business environment, and they take their work very seriously.
And of course, we're talking about kind of the elements of the industry that have serious money behind them. Of course, there's still, of course, the back alley sort of productions and whatnot do still take place. And one of the controversies that's endured over Deep Throat follows the accusations from the actress who was most prominently featured in that film, Linda Lovelace, that there were elements of coercion, of pressure, of even of having been drugged and essentially forced into her participation. Of course, that's very strongly denied by many of the others who were involved. And it sounds as though your impression of those you've met who are in the industry today would suggest that, at least today, that is not the norm, that is not...
You know, I don't believe it to be the norm, but I couldn't say that there's not some deep, dark corner of the adult industry that has these very bad players. I mean, I think they're out there and they exist, and I would even venture to say that a lot of the mainstream, more corporate and serious players in the adult industry don't associate or find that those type of bad players are part of what they do, but it's hard to say that they don't exist at all.
And it's really, it's virtually impossible, I think, to separate. Well, let me ask you first, do you regard this particular industry, the adult industry, as anything that is in significant ways different from any other industry? I mean, are there things about it that you think are unique, that do present unique problems or unique questions, or is it?
I think it's both, actually. Like, obviously, it's a very unique industry just because of the way people feel either very strongly negatively or positively about it. So I think that in and of itself, and you could probably say that about a lot of different industries, maybe the emerging industry around the marijuana laws that are coming out. People are going to feel very polarized with it, whether, you know, people are feeling that, you know, it's part of their rights, it's part of how they want to live. And then you have the other side of that coin, maybe someone who is very religious or has different moral compasses within themselves. They might feel totally opposite and feel that it's, you know, the most horrible thing on the planet. So I think it's very polarizing, and that makes the industry unique in and of itself. But the way in which the business seems to run today, you know, I think of my dad's stores. He has a couple of stores. There's Southern Exposure in Cocoa Beach. I'm sorry, that one is in Fort Pierce. And then there's the Premier in Orlando, if you're in the Orlando area watching the show. And you walk into any of those stores and you're experiencing a very big, high-end retail experience, like you would if you walked into a department store.
Now, has there been a journey or a transformation to the position you're articulating now and your feeling about it? When you first learned of your father's involvement, what did you think or did you feel initially? Was this something that you had not thought about in a deep way before and that you had to begin to try to form an opinion on?
I think so. But it was always, I think, posed to me in the right ways, that it was an industry for adults only, and that, you know, as I was discovering about what it was, either through pop culture or very conversations with my parents that were very, I have to say, basic in a way, because as a teenager and a child, you don't share any of the details about what it is, but always told to me it was for adults. It wasn't anything for kids or even teenagers. So, but as you get older and you realize what it is, of course you have to do some thinking, I think, to really, you know, come to terms with what it is and the place that your family took part in.
Did you have to have some distance from it before you began to think about it in the ways that, in other words, could you have, if the technology had been there, could you have blogged about it when you were 20?
I don't think so.
At what point did it begin to become something that you felt not only that you wanted, a story you wanted to tell, but one that you felt you could be comfortable telling?
I would say in my 20s, I never even thought about it that seriously. In my 20s, I would say, yes, my dad has an unusual job. He's in a business that I knew instinctively people didn't agree with. So it was really nothing I engaged with or even talked about that much. A lot of the friends, we went to high school together, and you probably never even knew.
No idea, no.
No idea. And I would say maybe only a handful of people, maybe one or two of my closest friends knew, because one, probably as a teenager or as a young adult, it's not something you really just think about to talk about. And then two, you know, I always knew that it was this kind of big deal, and that people just really thought it was wrong. And as you're getting to know people as a young professional, you're going out into the work world, it's just something you don't talk about. And there's a stigma carried with that.
Did you feel that you needed to get anyone's permission or gauge anyone's reaction before you began to think about actually writing this? Did you speak to your parents about it? Did anyone in particular give you pause? Anyone you were particularly concerned about, whether it's someone who was in your family or whether it's someone that was in your world at the time?
You know, obviously I talked to my parents first, and my father's first reaction was, I don't feel like it's interesting enough for you to write about, which I was kind of surprised, because I always felt, gosh, it was just such a big story, at least in my mind, in my family. I felt that it was a big story that was very connected to this big cultural moment of the last 40 years. But my dad was always very supportive. He just never felt he was that interesting enough to write about, which I found interesting. And my mom was always supportive, because I think it gave her a chance to tell her side of the story, because it was always so focused on, my dad was experiencing these trials, he was the one that was indicted, but my mother had a very important story to tell here as well, and I think for her, it was very important to get this down on paper and to talk about it.
And I have to say, and I'm saying this for the benefit of those of you who haven't read the book, and I wonder if you, Kristen, think that I have actually seen something that either you intended or that you're aware of, or whether I may have perceived parts of the book in a way that maybe you didn't anticipate. It does seem very much, it strikes me very much when I read it, as even though the title refers to your father,
right,
it seems to be a book that is very much focused on your mother, and very much focused on a kind of, and given the prominence of your grandmother in the story, it seems to be a very strong female point of view through most of the book.
Yes,
and of course, you would agree, I'm sure, that pornography there are certain issues that are societal, and issues that are legal, and issues for some people that are moral, but there's also, do you see any particular impact on gender issues and gender relations? We're talking about some very controversial areas of sexual interaction between men and women now, whether we're talking about what's going on campuses, and we're talking about what's going on with a celebrity like Bill Cosby, and hardly just Cosby. I mean, there are other celebrities, a DJ whose name is escaping me for the moment, very prominent in Canada, pretty much run out of his business by accusations that he's behaved badly toward women. You've got 50 Shades of Grey stirring up a whole lot of controversy right now. And I remember I actually went to the same university your father attended. Yeah. And at Villanova, I took a course, I recall clearly, with a professor named Carol Anthony. It was called Philosophy of Women. And it really struck me how much of that coursework was involved in reading female criticism and feminist criticism of pornography. Do you think that is a related issue, or do you think we've got to a point where it's really the business of it has separated from the culture so much?
I feel like when you broach the topic of sexual assaults on campus, I draw a pretty hard line that I don't feel that pornography or the adult industry contributes to that. I know people will differ and have a different argument or a feeling about that, but I draw a pretty hard line. The traditional aspects of the adult industry, in which it's meant for couples and it's meant for people to explore their sexuality, doesn't have anything to do with sexual assault or rape.
And I didn't mean to imply that it did. I guess what I was trying to articulate was the whole question of, I would think, I'm throwing out there and I want to know what you think of it, I would think that what's depicted in pornography is to some extent a depiction of what is already culturally programmed into people, And that it kind of, it's almost circular, where they reinforce one another to some extent.
That's a good word.
And I'm wondering if, with your having interviewed people who are involved in pornographic movie making today, whether you think that the attitude has changed along with maybe the general cultural attitudes, not only toward pornography and sex, but just toward gender roles, toward gender.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible to say that pornography has not had an influence on the way women and men view sex. It does. I mean, it's changed. I think it's influenced movies. It's influenced fashion. It influences even how women view their bodies. So I think yes, it's become a part of our culture. So it has some influence.
Do you think it's also changed by our changing attitudes toward gender? I mean, some of the individuals that you spoke of, I mean, the very fact that they are business women doing very well is not something that I would imagine would have been anticipated by people who were involved in the pornographic film industry at the very beginning. I don't think the idea of empowered women, I don't think Linda Lovelace having her own line was anything that anybody would have anticipated in 1972.
Exactly.
So do you think that we're moving to a place where perhaps at least the argument that pornography was dehumanizing to women, or at least that argument may be becoming less potent and less
I think it is. I think maybe some people would disagree with that and say, no, you're absolutely wrong. All pornography is degrading to women. I wouldn't agree with that statement. Is there pornography out there that's degrading to women? Probably in the fringes, in the dark corners. Yeah, it probably exists. It's something I wish didn't exist, but it's out there. But you get into this other tricky area where you're trying to decide. You can't decide for everybody, like what they can view, what they can't view, and you hope that the bad stuff, we can attack it and make it go away and prosecute in a way that makes sense, which still protects our free speech. But that's been very hard to do, I think, in our culture. So I think that's why it's still very controversial today.
So when someone comes to you with that kind of a debate or that kind of an argument, what do you usually say? What do you say to someone who approaches it as, well, this is dehumanizing, this is demeaning to women?
I'd have to ask them, what piece of pornography are you talking about? Can you give me a specific example?
Do you ever find it perhaps a little bit hypocritical that maybe some women who would make that complaint might be the ones who are flocking to 50 Shades of Grey?
Maybe, and 50 Shades of Grey, I know, has also been very controversial, and I didn't read the whole series. I've only read the first book. I found it a very interesting read. I didn't find it demoralizing or degrading at all. It was an unusual consensual relationship that I guess some people now, it's kind of opened the floodgates for them to explore a part of sexuality maybe they hadn't thought of. So in that regard, maybe I feel like that's okay, like for people to explore it. And if tons and millions of women are enjoying it, like that should be embraced in a way. And then there are other people out there who feel totally different, and they think, well, 50 Shades of Grey is encouraging, horrible violence against women. And my perception of that piece of erotic literature, I would not perceive it to be that way. And that's where, again, one person will perceive a piece of erotica or pornography or literature in one way, and someone else will interpret it very differently. And what it means to each individual person, leads to these debates and controversy around what it means for our culture.
I would imagine that in addition to those whose objections you encounter, that there must be some people to whom you speak who are more sympathetic than others, or who find that your position is something that they find influencing or impacting their own. And do you have positive experiences like that when you're dealing with people, as they kind of balance out the negative reactions you must get from others?
I think if it's promoting conversations about what sexuality and sex means for our culture, if it's promoting some kind of conversation about that, if it's not slut-shaming women into feeling like it's not okay to be a sexual being and to be very open about how they feel about that, then I think that's a positive thing to have those kind of conversations in a productive way. I think when you are secretive about sex, when it's kept in the closet, when it's not talked about in an open way, that's where you get into a very tricky area. I feel like you send women back into the dark ages. Like it's not allowed to be talked about, or it's a bad thing, or it's a dirty thing. And I don't think it should be viewed that way at all.
Now I know from having read the things you've written in your blogs and the things you've written in articles that you yourself are not a consumer of pornography.
I'm not. I'm really not.
And so you're looking at this from a slight bit of a remove, but is there anything that you learned as you started to explore it as a topic and a subject even beyond your family that surprised you?
I'm surprised that we're kind of still having the same debate about it. Like the culture has changed, pornography has become more accepted, it's become more mainstream, it's become more corporate, but I'm still surprised by the number of people who have this visceral negative reaction about it, I guess. And again, as you pointed out, I'm not a regular consumer of pornography, so I don't know the breadth and depth of everything out there. I don't really know if one person could have that kind of knowledge because there's just so much. But I think it's just a very individual choice. If someone chooses to partake in viewing pornographic material, like that's a very individual choice, and it's just not for everyone.
Is your father's involvement, is that something that at any time was uncomfortable for you in any dimension other than in terms of telling people about it?
You know, not really, because to me he's always been just dad. Really, like I never even, and I talk about this in the book, I never even walked into any of his stores until I really wanted to go and see what it was all about. It wasn't until I was 25, 26 years old that, you know, my cousin Christopher and I, we took a trip to Florida to really see what this was all about. And it was not by the urging of either one of my parents saying, yeah, come on down, I really want to show you the store and what it was all about. It was, you know, purely by our own curiosity that we wanted to see. And I think that was really the best way for me to learn about it.
Now I asked you about what surprised you most when you began to look at the subject broadly. When you began to actually talk to your parents about it in preparation for writing the book, were there surprises in their story? Were there things that were happening that not only you didn't realize were happening at the time, but that were not part of the narrative as you'd understood it when it had come to you in bits and pieces before researching?
I don't think I realized till much later how serious it was in terms of the potential jail time. There was a Broward County obscenity trial in 1978, and there were local FBI agents who were following, searching our track. Like, I didn't realize it was that level of intensity for what was, you know, at the time when I was growing up, you know there's trouble, you know there's turmoil, but I don't think I realized till much later really quite how serious it was.
Now, how did you find people when you actually brought the idea of the book to publishers, and you brought the idea, I presume, through an agent? Were you confident that you would find them interested? Was there any attempt to alter or influence your focus or what you were going to include? Was it in any way something that they had very strong opinions about how you should approach your own story?
Do you know, it's amazing. I remember when I first started writing this book, gosh, I think it's almost 8 or 9 years ago, and the very first outline or things that I wanted to say in a chapter outline had existed into what is now the book. And although when I was going through the writing process that changed a lot, and I took things out and I reordered it, it always kind of reverted back to what I had in my mind of wanting to present my parents' story first, and then the latter part presenting maybe funny stories that I remember or ways that I had learned about my family's history. So when we approached agents, I feel like we never really, we tried to take the criticism for what it was, and you kind of have to, when you're going out into the world with your own writing, accept good criticism, but have a good gut feeling about what you want to say and not change it so much just for a changing market. And I know that sounds really difficult because all writers today have to find their audience, have to find a market, and create their products as such if they want to sell any books. But if you're veering too far to twist and turn yourself into a way that's not really true to the story that you want to tell and what you want to write about and what you really know most about, then I think you get in an area of trouble. And I think any publisher would see that you're trying to twist yourself into a pretzel too much, and then it just doesn't work.
So was there any time where you encountered perhaps a desire on their part for you to go to places with the writing that you weren't feeling that you wanted to go? Or places you wanted to go that they didn't want to hear about?
It was, with publishers, it's pretty cut and dry. It's either yes or no. I had a great agent. His name is Craig Kaiser. He's awesome, and he was such a good guide for me in really thinking about how we wanted to tell this story and how he thought it should be presented to a publisher in a book proposal. And he was really great at that. And I have to say, like, you go to a publisher, and if they are kind of not on the same page with you, then you kind of know pretty early on it's not a relationship that's going to work to getting your book published and into the marketplace. So, I mean, I'm thinking of one example specifically where I had a publisher say, you know, if you would just tell more of the story about how the film Deep Throat was made, then that's something that we think would be sellable. And like that's a time where I had a gut reaction, and I thought to myself, and my agent agreed, like, that story's already been told a lot. I don't want to tell that story. I can't really tell that story because it's not something that my family was involved with. The making of Deep Throat, that is something altogether different. So it was, you know, you go through that process where you're trying to find the right publishing partner, and you just know pretty instinctively when someone has a comment like that it's not meant to be, and it's not, you know, you just move on and you try to find the right fit.
Now, you mentioned, for those who might not have known, you mentioned that you and I did go to high school together. We went to a Catholic high school together. We went to St. Thomas Aquinas, which I'm sure imposed a certain additional pressure on you to kind of keep quiet about your father's business activities. Now, was there any struggle, any additional struggle for you as a result of being presented with an opposite point of view by the school, or were you comfortable enough with your own attitudes and your own feelings about it after having thought about it as a result of your family's involvement, that you found that something you could simply push aside and not be bothered or affected by?
You know, when you're in high school, you just want to fit in. You just want to make friends. You don't want to draw a lot of attention, negative attention to yourself. And I kind of felt like that's where I was. I knew I was in an environment where, you know, I didn't go to grade school with a lot of the kids who went to St. Thomas, and I had maybe a few friends, but it was something that I just really knew would not, people at St. Thomas probably would not want that to be talked about a lot.
Had you already transitioned to a point in your life where you told the people in your life, you told friends? Had you already traveled far from keeping the circle small in high school? Or when you decided to write the book, did you find yourself thinking, you know, before I write this book, before I put this out there, I should tell my neighbor this story, or I should tell this person, or I should tell that person? Were there people who didn't know that you kind of felt you had to?
You know, it wasn't like this, like, oh my God, I have something to tell you. It wasn't anything like heavy like that. It was just coming to a place in my life where I felt that this was a good story. I was becoming a more curious writer. I wanted to do more writing. I felt like that I had a unique family story that other people would find interesting as well. And it became, when I started to tell people, it became more like market testing. So I would say, okay, well, I think this is a very interesting story, but you know, what if I told a coworker, or what if I told other people? So I started to push the envelope and broaden the scope of who I was sharing this information with and what their reaction was. And I have to tell you, people were really great, open. Wow, that's really interesting. Tell me more about it. I didn't feel as if I was being stigmatized for it in any way. And I kind of took it as, well, I picked really great friends and coworkers and people that I chose to associate myself with, and that's how, that's generally that they're just open-minded people.
I understand that in a very peculiar way. I understand that because actually I had something similar. I never wrote a book about it, but my father was, and when I say similar, I mean exactly the opposite. My father was a Roman Catholic priest. And that was something that I did not tell people for years, and then I found when I finally began to tell people that it was almost a bit of fun. It was, well, it wasn't so much a dark secret, but it was one of those things which on an entirely different level not everyone would have understood. And some might have judged, although not nearly as fully as I'm sure you at times felt judged. But I'm wondering if, like me, at any point it became almost an odd kind of pleasure or relief to be speaking of something that you'd not spoken of for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely part of it, and I have to say instinctively, if I had a feeling that possibly someone would react very negatively to that kind of a story or sharing, that maybe I wouldn't have shared it. Like, maybe I unconsciously selected the people who I was going to tell, and it just so happened to be a lot of people that I know. But yeah, if there came a situation where I maybe sensed that someone would react extremely negatively, maybe I would not have shared it. So.
And did your parents go through something like that? Were there any estrangements in the family? Were there any difficulties that they went through in their relationships when your father's involvement became known?
I think different family members, they supported my parents, they loved my parents, they were kind of with them through thick or thin, but I think they did individually in their own way had to come to grips with, okay, what is pornography? What does this mean? And it's being prosecuted by the federal government, and how do I feel about that? So I do think probably each of my individual family members had their own unique experience with how they thought about this issue and how it related to their family or either one of my parents. Like, I know my grandmother, Maria, which I write about in the book, she kind of, she took a very hands-on approach, like, I'm going to learn about this, I'm going to go visit my father's club. At one point he owned a strip club. I'm going to go see the movie. Like, she was always one that she had to have all the information, to make a decision or to guide her in whatever her actions were going to be. She never did anything just by, she was always the type going to the library to look things up.
At what point did it begin to, because I'm sure it wasn't overnight, I'm sure that with your father, with the ends of the trials, I'm sure there was a period of time where there was anticipation of the next one. Was there going to be a third one? Was something more going to happen? I know, of course, during the 80s, so just a couple of years after the trials, you had the Meese Commission on Pornography, and you had a lot of, under the Reagan administration, you had a renewed attention to it, and briefly it looked as though there would be a renewed vigor in prosecution and a renewed...
Yeah, and I didn't write a lot about it in the book because there were so many local trials that happened within the state of Florida where my father had partnered in adult businesses, adult retail stores in the Orlando area, Lakeland, Tampa, Daytona, and during the 80s and even up until the early 90s, there were many local cases that came up that I didn't even write about. I would have had, maybe this is the second book, but there were lots of legal struggles to stay in business, lots of wrangling.
Well, it sounds as though there was an end point, though. It sounds as though it's not continuing to this day, which I would imagine it's
really
not. Was there a point at which, a point at which there was a kind of conscious relief? Did your father ever express to you, or did you ever feel yourself that, well, finally, what had always kind of hovered over us as a possibility is not hovering over us any longer?
You know, that would be a better question for my dad, but I guess I could venture a guess when Clinton was in office during the 90s, when, you know, there was a Democrat in the White House, is a time when a lot of these prosecution and obscenities kind of quelled. Like the Justice Department wasn't taking such an active role in prosecuting obscenity. And also during that time, the internet became, first and foremost, you know, became a real part of our society. And I think people today are still trying to figure out like how the internet is, you know, influencing the adult industry. It's obviously transformed everything. It's transformed all kinds of retail businesses, but I guess if I had to pinpoint one time, it would have to be maybe like the 92, 93, where maybe things started to kind of, you know, we got to a state as a society where the federal government at least wasn't taking a real active role in these kind of cases.
And how did your father feel when Linda Lovelace, this was some years after the period we're talking about, when the accusations first were made that she had been coerced into making the film?
You know, I have a good friend, his name is Eric Danville, and he wrote a book called The Complete Linda Lovelace, and, you know, he had a chance to get to know her personally and have a personal relationship with her in the course of writing the book. And, you know, it's very clear that she was in an awful abusive relationship with her husband, Chuck Traynor, and there's things that had been in the media about, you know, she was held at gunpoint and, you know, things that she said apparently out of hand or just as a metaphor really were blown out of proportion. But was she coerced into doing it? I don't think so. I mean, personally, from things that I've read, you know, but it's clear that she was in a very destructive relationship, and how that impacted her involvement in the film, I'm not sure anyone will ever really have a clear answer as to how that played a role in her getting into the industry. Because at times she embraced it, and then other times she did not.
Now, this is extremely speculative, even more than some of the other things I've asked you, but I'm curious, again, because you write about the subject broadly. Do you think the fact that it has become, if not more mainstream, then certainly it's gotten nearer the mainstream, the fact that it's gotten so much bigger and so much more corporate, do you think any of this in any way might actually have the positive, beneficial effect of making it more difficult for that kind of coercion, or that kind of, if it ever happened at all? But certainly it must have happened in some instances with some people. Even if not on that film. Do you think that that's actually been made less likely by the changes?
Yeah, I mean, I could not say that I am a total insider to those who are producing the films and what's going on in the adult industry, but the one thing that's been clear is that, you know, DVD sales and the making of productions are definitely on the decrease. And you're seeing things like the tube sites and YouPorn and people who are voluntarily going into these internet mediums to provide, you know, any kind of pornography that you can think of. And that's not something that's driven, it's driven by the adult industry creating these platforms or these technologies to deliver some of this homegrown content. But you know, the production of films is definitely not the mainstay of the adult industry as it once was. If you look at the novelties and adult sex toys, those are a really huge part of what's going on in the adult industry now. So, I mean, it's hard to just say, okay, so now that the film productions and, you know, how are you parsing that out? I would say the very reputable adult companies, which there are many, and the good agents, they do not allow their actresses and actors to be treated in a coercive manner. And I think we said earlier in the show, the ones that are doing that are really the ones that are in the deep dark corners. They're shunned. I would say the traditional, more mainstream adult industry type players would not even want to associate themselves with someone like that.
Now, I know you've written in support of things like condom use on porn sets in the wake of
I know
certain
I have to say
events
I've changed my mind a lot on that. Measure B, you're referring to.
Yes.
The LA County. You know, I think it's a clear play by people who are very against pornography. It's a clear play to push the adult industry out of LA County. There's really no way that LA County could effectively administer or oversee the types of requirements that they are asking adult industry providers, you know, for all of their actors to, you know, wear condoms and the different things that they're requiring in the on-site production of such films. So there is a clear play that they're trying to push those adult industry production folks out of business, which is not okay. But on the flip side, I often think about, you know, the kind of influence that pornography does have, and kind of being a child of the 80s and being very aware of the HIV and the AIDS scare and how important it is to practice safe sex. I kind of feel like I wish, can't you just make, you know, wearing a condom sexy, you know, so you can kind of hit home those messages. But from what I've read, you know, it's not those kind of products don't sell as well. So then you get into, you know, the area of, okay, well, what kind of product are you making that's going to serve what your customer really wants? So it becomes very tricky. But yes, I have said in the past, like, why can't you just make condom use sexy? And then you're kind of, you know, you're providing these safe sex messages, which I think are very positive. And there are companies like Wicked Pictures who they're already condom only anyway.
Now that actually we've taken, without intending to, I've kind of created a little contrast here between the kind of legal threat that even a distributor could be under when your father was distributing Deep Throat versus the kind of legal action that's taken today, which we've just kind of established.
Right.
With this example, it almost has to be indirect, because it doesn't appear as though any community would support the kind of challenge or the kind of legal action that your father faced today. So do you feel that when the subject turns to either the use of condoms or turns to requiring tests, AIDS tests, and other tests for sexually transmitted diseases, do you feel that that's frequently really just the last effort to try to take some sort of legal action that would put an end to the adult industry?
I mean, yeah. I mean, yes. I think the anti-pornography advocates are trying to get more creative about their approach to how they might try to regulate pornography in some way or control it in some way, which, you know, then you bump into that fine line of where are you coming into an area where you're infringing on free speech. Again, this brings up our age-old controversy around this issue. But yeah, I think this is a creative way to try to legislate the adult industry. And I also feel, you know, I feel as if other traditional ways that they've tried to do that through the obscenity laws and the community standard laws that are currently on the books, and given where we are with the, you know, the internet no longer has us set, you know, our community is worldwide now. And, you know, taking that approach to deciding what is a community and what within those communities can you decide what's obscene, it's nearly impossible. So yes, I think these new ways of kind of controlling the adult industry is why you're seeing these kind of mandates or things coming up on ballot initiatives about this. And actually the UK just recently had a whole list of you know, different sexual acts that they have tried that cannot be depicted in the production of you know, pornography movies that are produced in the UK. But interestingly, with that is they can't control what other production outside of the UK is producing and then what's being viewed by people within their country. So again, very complicated.
Well, Kristen, what's next for you? Are you planning to write another book? Are you planning to write that second book to which you alluded?
You know, I have a lot of ideas for other books. I've often thought there are so many people like me who have parents or who are in the adult industry or were in the adult industry in the very early days. I love to write about their experience, learning about what their parents did for a living. I don't think my story is the only story. There are many other interesting stories that are sort of connected and like mine, but everyone, I think, has a different experience with that. And I've also had the idea of maybe branching into fiction. You know, I'm fascinated with my grandmother Maria's story, and she came from a very colorful family. My great-grandfather was an early saloon owner in Philadelphia, and he was an innovative businessman at the time. And her sisters were characters in and of themselves, and unfortunately they are no longer with us, so I think it might be a fictionalized story about them, based on them.
If I'm not mistaken, and I'm being a little presumptuous here, but I'm going to guess that the many interviews you've done since your book, The Pornographer's Daughter, was released, I'm guessing of the many interviews, this is probably the first you've done with an old friend.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you if there's anything that you always wish the interviewer would ask and they just don't ask. Anything you always wish that you would get to talk about.
I feel like we cover a lot of territory.
Well, good. I will take that as a compliment to my interview skills.
I think we did pretty well. I think we did well.
Well, Kristen, it's been a pleasure having you with us and having you be the very first interview on Bleeple.com. And I would encourage anyone who's been viewing and listening to us to pick up a copy of the book, The Pornographer's Daughter. It really is an interesting read. And I congratulate you on that success.
Thank you. I think it's great to be here.
Well, we're going to call it an evening now, but of course, Bleeple.com will be on again tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock. It'll be Reagan and Dennis, and I will be with you tomorrow night at 8. Have a good night.